Hello and welcome back to the Metropol Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. So this is the final data pack of the Flashpoint Cycle. It's called Quorum. We went through the runner card side and we took a slight detour to specifically talk about Sepher. But let's get back to the corpse side, right? Shall we? We have 9 cards on the corpse side to talk about, so let's just dive right in. This is the first one, and where we start, it's sensor net activation. This is an HB agenda. It's a security agenda, which, again, I promise you the subtypes are going to matter in the near future. And it says when you score it, you get to place 1 agenda counter on sensor net activation. Now, you can use that hosted agenda counter whenever you can use a paid ability, and you can res a Biroid, ignoring all costs. When the turn ends, you have to derez that Biroid. So when the turn ends means if you use it on your turn, end of your turn, and if you do it on the runner's turn at the end of their turn, that Biroid's over. So I'm not actually that impressed with this card. It's currently there's a couple problems working against it. Firstly, it is a 3-1 agenda, and it's really hard to make good 3-1 agendas in Netrunner, and that's largely because you need to score 7 points in this game. There's a couple reasons why people are running a lot of global food in their decks. Specifically, most HB decks are running a lot of 3-2 agendas, maybe 1 or 2 4-2s, and then global food. Global food initiative, this really good 3-5 agenda. And the reason why is when you're playing Netrunner as a corp, it's really important that you understand that you have to score 7 points somehow, unless of course you have some sort of alternate win condition. And the problem with 3-1 agendas is they do very little to help you win the game. If you're scoring a 3-1 agenda, that's also a lot of time and a lot of credits, but then after that you have to score 3 more agendas, 3-2 agendas, and compare that to just scoring 2 3-2s and then a single 3-5, which is just a heck of a lot easier. So regardless, the only decks that are currently running 3-1 agendas are agendas where the ability on that card is absolutely so good to their specific ID or their specific game plan that it actually helps so much. And sensor net activation, I don't think does that much. What it lets you do, it lets you res a Biroid card. It's important to understand that Biroid doesn't mean for sure Biroid Ice, as much as there is mostly Biroid Ice, but it lets you basically run res one Biroid card for the entirety of a single turn. There are some matchups when that's actually entirely useful. Against things like Valencia with blackmail, it's a bit clumsy to use because you have to play it before Val blackmails, but technically you can kind of protect the server. I think it's probably the best against things like these 1-turn kill hyperdrive or DDoS cape decks, and it's actually a pretty sweet counter to that. I think though a better counter to that is just probably winning faster by only scoring 3-2 agendas, but this might actually help a bunch. So that's what does this work well with? If you want to res a Biroid, if you're gonna res it on your turn, I guess you can do this with the Foundry and maybe pull another piece of ice from your hand. So you can use the Foundry ability on your turn and the runner's turn, hopefully. I'm not that impressed with that idea. Otherwise, you can do some cute things with this. In theory, if you use the condition on this card, so you res your Biroid, and then you either forfeit or exchange of information this card back to the runner side, the ability that says when the turn ends, derez that Biroid, that is no longer active, so your Biroid stays up for good. Now this card says you res the Biroid ignoring all costs, which includes additional costs. So things like Enforcer 1.0, which is a Biroid that doesn't see a lot of play, but technically has an additional cost. You can res that for free, which is kind of nice. I think the only thing that would require for this card to be really exciting for me is an asset or something like that that's really hard to res, maybe very expensive, or maybe has a really strong additional cost. And you can res that asset specifically on your turn or the runner's turn and get to use its ability, maybe just trash it with something like product recall. I don't know. I think I'd be a lot more excited with this card if it was a 2-0. Just because that's an interesting thing to score. You can maybe combo that with team sponsorship, and then it just basically gives you a free ice in exchange of an agenda. Even that's not so good. If this card had 2 counters on it, maybe. I'm not that excited. I think the art is awesome. Having all these Biroids, they mostly look like, public service Biroids, all turn and look at you at the same time. Something's up. I don't know. I'm not that excited. I think it might be a bit underpowered, but it's definitely an interesting card to put in against certain decks. This is Violet level clearance, and it is a terminal operation, and it's another HB card. So we've had 2 other clearances before this. We've had blue level, well, in order, you have green level, blue level, now we hit violet level. If we were doing the whole rainbow, I think that's it. That's the end of the line, right? I'm not sure if I think we might have had black label clearance spoiled. I'm not entirely sure. I might be making that up. So for 5 credits, you get a terminal transaction operation. Transaction is a keyword that the core Wayland can use, so you can make a bit more money off of this. Terminal means that after you play this card, it's the end of your turn. There's no shenanigans to currently get around that. It's just your entire turn ends, so you generally want to play this last click. And when you play this card, you gain 8 credits and draw 4 cards. So as long as you have 5 credits, you play this last click, and you gain 3 credits and draw 4 cards. This card is also one of the new operations that we've been seeing in Flashpoint Cycle that has a trash cost. So if the runner ever accesses this operation and chooses to pay 1 credit, they can trash it, go straight to archives. Now this is an interesting card. One of the worst things you can generally do in Netrunner as a corporation is draw as a last click or during the end of your turn. And that's because you generally want to draw early in your turn because there's a chance that you'll draw better ice, you'll draw better economy. But most of the time is you want to know where your agendas are when you're playing Netrunner, just so you know what servers that you need to protect and so you can plan out your turn better. So in theory, drawing last click is actually a pretty bad thing to do. This card you obviously play, so draw 4 is basically like saying have 3 more cards in your hand. So if you have this and you play a card, you're going to be overdrawing 3 cards and you have to discard 3 cards into your archive, If you have a Jackson on the table, maybe that lets you aggressively cycle your cards, which is pretty okay. You can also run things like Cybernetics Court, which is an HB acid that gives you plus hand size, so there's a chance that you don't have to trash your cards. So that's actually kind of okay. But largely, I see this card mostly in cerebral imaging. If you haven't seen cerebral imaging, it's not played that oftenly at casual tables, but it actually has a fair amount of play on competitive tables. And cerebral imaging is an ID from creation and control, and it says your hand size is equal to the number of credits in your card pool. So generally, if you're playing this, you're not going to have to discard any cards. A lot of the cerebral imaging decks are trying to score 7 points in a single turn through this like absurd combo that involves accelerated diagnostics, power shutdown, and shipment from Sansan. If you want to know a bit more about these combo decks, I'm not going to explain them in any more detail than that. There's a couple links I'll probably link in the descriptions below. There's some really good articles on ANR and Z, which have been describing this deck in like great detail if you want to look at it. They're actually pretty interesting. So I think this card actually helps cerebral imaging a lot because cerebral imaging wants to do 2 things: have a sufficient amount of money and draw enough cards into their hand so that they can score out. And that basically solves both of those problems relatively elegantly. One thing that does confuse me about this card is that it does have a trash cost. And so far, all the cards in this Flashpoint Cycle that have had a trash cost have been aggressive cards that have impacted the runner in a really bad way. Things like enforcing loyalty, Boom is probably the most deadly one. But these are all cards that the runner wants to access because if they don't, the corp is going to bring problems to them. And that's kind of the opposite of Violet level. Violet's like just a kind of passive economy card, a kind of weird one too. So I'm not sure why this one required a trash cost. Maybe they just wanted to put a trash cost on an on-access HB card because I don't think we have one yet. So that's kind of strange. The cool thing, though, about having a trash cost on the card is it does make that cerebral imaging matchup a bit more interesting, considering I think only 3 Jackson Howards in our deck do have a trash cost. So it makes some of your accesses slightly more fun and you feel a bit destructive. So that's kind of cool. I guess with a trash cost, you can also remove it from the game with things like Salset Slums. So that's okay. So onto the Jinteki cards, and we have Chiyashi. Chiyashi. I don't know actually how to pronounce it. I couldn't find good phonetic help. Chiyashi is a Japanese word, and it's a word for a sort of fortification. It's basically a fort that's largely made of like packed mud and wood. It's relatively simple from my Wikipedia reading. And so this is meant to be a barrier. Just want to talk about that art real quickly. It's super abstract. I'm a big fan of it. I can't kind of make heads or tails of it, but I'm really enjoying it in sort of the original Netrunner way of kind of abstract science fiction-y stuff. I'm digging it. But this piece of ice is 12 credits to res. It's in barrier and AP, so it's probably going to hurt you. It's 8 strength, which is pretty sizable, and it has an interesting ability that punishes AIs. It says whenever the runner breaks a subroutine on Chiyashi while there is an AI installed on the board, you can trash the top 2 cards of the runner stack. And I said that improperly. It's not you can, you actually have to. There's 3 subroutines on this thing, and they happen in the best order possible. Do 2 net damage, do 2 net damage, and then end the run. This is an absurdly punishing and relatively taxing ice. If the runner hits this, it does 4 net damage, and not 4 net damage in one subroutine, so it's a bit worse to I've had worse, just because it has a higher chance of the runner walking away from that. But doing 4 net damage in a single card is pretty sizable, and something that just the existence of Chiyashi is going to have to change how runners play and the sort of risk decisions that they make before they're deciding to initiate runs. A lot of times when you're running against Jinteki, you want to make sure that you do have your killer up just so you're not blown out by things like Komainu and Cortex Lock. And now with Chiyashi, it's another card you're going to have to worry about. The fact that it's 12 credits means that there's probably less opportunities in which this can be res against when you're playing against Jinteki. So and maybe that helps you a bunch, but it is definitely a punishing piece of ice to hit. In terms of the AI punishing thing, I think that's actually really interesting. Prior to IP block, which I guess I'll pull up, all of the AI hate ice in this game have just been harder to deal with AI. I guess Swordsman did trash AI breakers, but the idea was like things like wraparound, they were just difficult to deal with if you didn't have AI. And things like IP block and Chiyashi actually punish you for having an AI on the table, even if you're not using it, which I think is a pretty excellent design space considering how strong AI breakers have classically been. And I like the fact that there's more cards that allow you to punish it. It's always been like for the last couple months when there's a lot of Faust, people were playing a lot of Swordsman, playing a lot of wraparound, I guess, and this just gives you more flexibility if the AI meta flares up again. Now, the cool thing about that AI punishment is that no matter what, you can either trash the 2 net damage subroutine, or you can lose the top 2 cards of your deck. And that's an interesting choice. No matter what, 2 cards are going to be hitting your heap, and it's not always obvious what's better, whether you want to lose cards from hand or whether you want to lose cards from the top of your deck. Losing cards from hands obviously protects you from dying against Jinteki, but getting cards in your heap is also, like sometimes getting cards into your heap from your hand is good too, because maybe you're holding on to one of your from a heap breakers that you're going to need in the near future. It's not entirely obvious. Also, I've had worse changes the math, and I think that's actually pretty interesting. Breaking this though with a Faust on the table is just super difficult, and you're going to lose 6 cards, so I just don't think that's possible. Now, in terms of, like, I really bummed about this. If you've talked, or if you've listened to, oh, thanks HB Update. Have you been there the whole time? If you've been watching the last video I put up about Cipher, I'm kind of incredibly apprehensive about spending 12 credits on a piece of ice. And that's largely because of the existence of Cipher and Parasite. There's a big chance that the runner's going to hit this. It might do 4 net damage, which is pretty sweet. But then next turn, or even that turn, there's a chance they'll Parasite this instantly. And you basically spend 12 credits to do 4 net damage, which is not a good exchange of credits. So for that reason, I'm not that stoked to pay 12 credits for this piece of ice, and I don't see myself playing it for a bit. Obviously, the meta can change, and it can be good at some point. I think the best place to play this card is specifically in Blue Sun, just because it is expensive, hard to break, so you can overstate AI it with pretty good returns. It's also a punishing face check, which is a thing Blue Sun's really good at doing, and it is less influenced than all the other options that a lot of people have been using for that card slot in their Blue Sun deck, so it's technically less influenced than the comparable DNA tracker and sort of or Janus 1.0. So this is definitely an interesting card. Next in Jinteki, we have Psychokinesis, which I just want to say I love the art on this card. It reminds me so much of the art from Arkham Horror LCG. If you haven't tried out that game, it's another game that just came out from Fantasy Flight Games, and it's actually in a lot of ways similar to Netrunner. You have like a click economy, you have like 3 actions a turn, and you have a lot of choice in what you do, and I've been just entirely digging it, so you might want to check it out. The art on Arkham Horror looks a lot like this, and I could see this being in either game really. So this is Psychokinesis. It's a Jinteki operation. It's also another terminal card. So again, once you play this, that's it. You have to hand over your turn to the runner. And it's cost 1, it's 2 influence, and it says, look at the top 5 cards of R&D. If any of those cards are agendas, assets, or upgrades, you may install one of those cards in a remote server. Cool. So there's 2 parts of this card. First is you can look at the top 5 cards of your deck, and that actually is a really valuable thing to do in Netrunner. Knowing the next 5 cards of your deck lets you basically plan out your next 2 or 3 turns with perfect information. As long as the runner's not going to be able to shuffle, or you don't shuffle R&D, you're going to know what the runner's capable of accessing, so you know the worth of accessing. You know what your traps are if you're playing Jinteki, so you might know what your snares are, and that's actually really good. But more importantly, you're going to know how soon you're going to draw an agenda, and or when you can score it. So maybe you should build a remote server, or maybe you'll have an ice coming up that helps you, or maybe an economy card. And I think that's really, really useful. There is a card from the core set called Precognition, which doesn't see a lot of play, that lets you do something similar. It lets you rearrange cards, which is arguably better. This card doesn't get a lot of play, and I can kind of see why, just because it's not generally an up-tempo play. You do this and it helps you, but yeah, I don't know. I still think this card's way better than people think it is. And this lets you do that. You don't rearrange, but just looking at the top 5 cards of your deck is definitely useful. Now, the second part of this card, I think, makes Psychokinesis easier to stomach compared to Precognition, because almost no matter what, it will advance your board state in some way, and that's generally something you want to be doing. So about the installing cards, firstly, it's a May ability, which is super important to know. So if you look at the top 5 cards of your deck and you don't see if it's like an agenda that you don't want to install naked and the rest is all ice and operations, you don't have to jettison your agenda off into a naked remote. So you can just play one, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, and be that. Now, in terms of agendas, I think this is okay. In Netrunner, you can be something called R&D locked, which the idea is if the runner is able to check the top card or top 2 cards, perhaps, of your R&D every turn, you're never going to draw an agenda unless you can shuffle R&D or draw super aggressively. And this helps you break R&D lock, which is something that's actually quite useful in the game. The thing about agendas, though, is you're doing this as a terminal action. So if you're installing something like a 4-2 agenda, which I think if you're playing like a Glacier deck in Jinteki, you're probably playing agendas that are 4-2 agendas and above, mostly considering that Jinteki only has 2 3-2 agendas, and one of them's pretty just not good. It's just a blank 3-2 largely, so that's not exciting. But if you're playing a 4-2 agenda, something like Caprice Nisse, and you install it as your last click, you're not going to be able to score it next turn. Oh, sorry, I meant to say Nisse Mark II. You're not going to be able to install it next turn. Advance it and score it next turn, because it's going to need 4 advancements. Unless you have things to get around that. Maybe you're fast advancing with Trick of Light, so that can help. You can also play Tenon Institute, and maybe get an advancement token on that agenda you've installed and then score it. Or even more fun, you can play Biotech and then play, I think it's the Greenhouse, one of the options on the back that lets you put 4 advancement tokens on a single card. So that's interesting. Also, if you're installing an agenda and scoring it next turn with Psychokinesis, you could install Protein Source and fast advance. Well, not fast advance, but basically score 3 points relatively quickly, which is kind of exciting. I think the assets or upgrades part is probably the way that this card is going to be used the most. Even just being able to look at the top 5 cards of your deck and then installing any asset from the top 5 is really good. So you pay 1 and you get to install one of the cards that you haven't drawn yet. So maybe if you're playing Industrial Genomics, that is things like cards you need, like your tech startups. That's probably one word. Oh no, great. Tech startup, that's good. Maybe it's stuff like your hostile infrastructure. Just cards that you would be installing anyways, and now you can look at the top of your deck and choose which one you want to install if your HQ or the cards you're holding are not that good. And I think that's okay. Even if you install a Jackson just to shuffle and get cards out of hand, like that'll save you in a pinch. Jinteki also does have a lot of good defensive upgrades. You can't put them on your central servers, you have to put them on remotes. So maybe you install Advanced Nisse Mark II and last click you Psychokinesis in the hopes that you'll get your your Caprice Nisse or Marcus Batty or something like that. And I think like that's a bit of a gamble, but yeah, so maybe that works out, maybe it doesn't. I still think that's an okay card. Getting your Caprices and your Marcus Baddies from R&D into a remote server is actually really important, because that's where they're protected. While if they are in R&D, they're one to trash, and they can, if nothing gets through R&D, you're never going to see them, and that's a problem. So Psychokinesis is interesting. I think it's quite okay. Also, by looking at the top cards of your deck, you can set up things like Mutate. And I think Mutate's really exciting considering we did also get Chiyashi in the same pack and you're able to res it for very cheaply. I think that's great. You can also play things like Hasty Relocation. So maybe you know the top 3 cards so you can build some sort of combos. Also Accelerated Diagnostics works too. Accelerated Diagnostics. And these are all good stuff. Psychokinesis is also 2 influence, so it's not absurd to consider someone splashing it, considering that you can actually do some pretty impressive stuff with Accelerated Diagnostics. This is the beginning of the NBN cards we have for this pack, and we have Net Quarantine. Net Quarantine is an agenda. It's a 4 for 2, so advance it 4 times, get it 2 agendas. Again, it's a security agenda, which is subtype, which is something that will matter at some point, and it has 2 abilities on it. Firstly, the runner's base link strength is reduced to 0 during the first trace each turn. Secondly, when the runner increases their link strength by spending credits, gain 1 credit for every 2 credits that they spend. I adore this piece of this agenda. I think this is actually a really good agenda because it does 2 things and both of them are very unique and very interesting and can actually help you win games. So it's a 4-2 agenda, which a lot of times if you're playing NBN, that might be an alien concept to you. You're probably playing a lot of 3-2s and maybe some like, what's it called? Explodapalooza, that's a good one. But this is actually very interesting, and in certain decks, specifically like Glacier-y decks, I think this is quite good. Glacier NBN has been an idea that's been floating around for a while, but it hasn't really come to fruition just yet. It might be missing certain cards, I think mostly defensive upgrades at this point. Whether or not it's smart to play Glacier currently, because of Sephir, is a different question altogether, but this is very interesting. So the first part of this agenda says the runner's base link strength is reduced to 0 during the first trace each turn. So that is comparable, like, well, it's not entirely comparable, but this is the only other card, I think, in the card pool that basically fought directly against Link. It's Net Police, and you have credits to fight Link. This card is absolutely horrible. It's 1 to res, it's 1 to trash, so it's not even hard to trash. Like, this thing could be 3 or 5 to trash, and it still would be a bit underwhelming. But again, this is an earlier card in Netrunner, so a lot of them weren't that good. I actually remember there is another card. It's called Dedicated Satellite or something. How many cards the word dedicated in them? A lot. Oh man, I'm not gonna remember what it is, but there is a card. Whatever. There is a NBN card that gives you 3 recurring credits to use on traces. So maybe that's not entirely correct. There might be 2 cards that do it. There are a lot of decks that have been going around in the last 2 months or so that have been stacking Link. Using things like Rabbit Hole from the core set is generally the way they do it. And largely it's because of this ID, which has been for a long time a very oppressive and a very strong ID, controlling the message. And the thing with controlling the message is that if you're trashing any cards that they install, which you're generally going to have to do considering they install some very valuable assets, there's going to be a trace 4. And if that fires, you gain a tag. So your options are either spending a click and 2 credits every turn to remove a tag, while still respecting hard-hitting news and other punishments, or beating a trace. And a lot of runners found out just running Link basically turns this ability off, and so it was good to do. Now, the problem was if the runner ran a lot of Link, so many of the cards in the NBN card pool are dead. So many of the ice actually have traces on them. Things like Archangel, Resistors are a really good option. Like if the runner has 4 Link, this card is totally dead. Archangel is another one that's seen quite often, and can't think of any of them good at the top of my head, but that's not right. Turnpike also has trace 5 on it. There's just a lot of ice that can trace. And if you have a lot of Link, so many of the cards potentially in an NBN deck can be dead. The idea is when you score this, even if the runner is stacking a lot of Link, you have a reprieve. It's only once per turn, right? And that might be just enough considering controlling the message only fires the first time a turn. So if you score this, controlling the message is turned back on, and that actually is probably really good for controlling the message. Now, the second part of this is whenever the runner spends credits to boost their traces, you actually make money back. And this is my favorite part about the design of this card. If this card actually only said the thing at the top, like the trace strength goes down to 0, this card would be dead in a lot of matchups. A lot of runners don't have Link. A lot of people aren't running Link cards in their deck. And for that reason, it looks a lot less. Base Link strength is reduced to 0 during the first trace every turn. Does that also mean that Geist's like breakers fall out of the cloud? Does that mean that? Because that's huge. That's only during a link, right? Okay, I'd have to look into that. I just thought of that, and that seems like a problem. Anyways, whenever the runner increases their link strength by spending credits, gain 1 for every 2 credits they spent. So not only do you have very little link if you want to beat things, but now if you are trying to boost traces, the corp gets money. And now if you're, like, for example, if you're playing against a CTM and you now have 0 link for the CTM trace and it's trace 4, if you boost, the corp gets money, so you're probably not going to boost, so the traces are probably going to fire. And that's really good, obviously. Well, you're not making money, but it's still good because your traces are firing. The core set ability, I've played a bunch with making news, which is the core set NBN, and there's a big problem with a lot of abilities in Netrunner that don't see a lot of play, and it's largely because their abilities only work if they're based off of ice. So much of the NBN card pool has traces. The majority of the traces are on ice. So if the subroutines are not firing on the pieces of ice, this ability is largely dead. So the quality of this card, making news, as well as the quality of net quarantine, depend largely on how often you can trace the runner on your own terms. Because if you can, the link strength will matter, but also the gaining credits to boost link strength will matter as well. And there's actually a couple cards that let you trace either proactively or at least consistently. I got a couple here. The first is Restructured Data Pool, which I think is entirely it's super important if you're running making news and or this agenda, just because if you have this scored, you can hit trace 2 over and over again, and the runner's either going to have to pay 2 credits to boost their trace, 2 or 1 credits, and so you might be making money from that just so they don't get a tag. And if they get a tag, I promise you bad things will happen. If you're running tracing news, you're also probably running media blitz. I mean, restructured data pool. You're also probably running media blitz. Just because if the runner scores a media blitz, you can scores a restructured data pool, you can media blitz for it. And now that agenda is on, so now you can start tracing them. And say one of the traces lands, you exchange of information, the card back, and that's really oppressive. Media blitz also works really well with net quarantine. So if the runner steals a net quarantine and you're playing controlling the message, you can media blitz it, and now even if they're stacking link, your traces just got a lot more oppressive. Other ways to fire, just things like Manhunt is really good. This generally fires every turn if the runner doesn't play a current, if they are running, which I assume they're going to have to at some point. Door to Door also technically works, but it's largely I just think this card is overcosted for what it does. I don't think it's particularly good, but that's technically another option. And last thing I just want to mention, because I think you have to, and I don't know how to spell it, so I'm just going to write the tech, is Aryabhata Tech, which is a big deal because this makes traces even more difficult. The idea is now if a runner wants a boost to match a trace, you're going to get money regardless whether they boost it or whether they fail to it. If they fail to it, there's going to be a credit differential, and if they boost to it, there's also going to be a larger credit differential. So if you have some Aryabhata text rezzed and one of these net quarantines scored, traces are going to be really, 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 really bad. And that's quite interesting if you can fire them as much as you like. With restructured data pool, you're kind of good to go. Lastly, just with this thing scored, the math on things like C-source and hard-hitting news get really interesting. Like if you C-source someone, you pay 2 and it's trace 3. So if the runner wants to boost into it, they're going to have to pay at least 3 credits to get up to strength, which means that you're going to gain 1 credit. And there's a really good likelihood that you can play C-source and boost it by a couple credits. Maybe you're playing with making news as well. And the runner's going to want to boost up to that. Like they're going to want to not get tagged, right? So they're going to pay like 6 credits to get up to the trace, and you're actually going to get more money. There's a possibility that you can make more money on just firing and losing the trace after boosting it, right? Maybe not entirely. That actually doesn't line up now that I've said it, because you're going to be boosting the trace unless you have like those recurring credits. But the idea is that you can make like really heavy hard-hitting newses and really heavy C-sources be not that expensive for you to play. And mid-seasons replacements, stuff like that. And that's kind of interesting. We have an NBN piece of ice coming up. This is Herald. It's a code gate. It's 2 to res, 1 strength, and it's one of these ice that when encountered, the runner has to reveal it, and they encounter that ice as if it was installed. This one doesn't have a cost when you access it, not like Archangel, so it's just basically good to go. It also does have a trash cost, so when the runner accesses it, they can pay 1 after they encounter it to trash it, and it'll be in the archives. This also on encounter ability doesn't fire from archives. So you have 2 subroutines. Firstly, the corp gains 2 credits. That's a fine subroutine. And the second one's a bit wonky. It says the corp may pay up to 2 credits to put that many number of advancement tokens on a card that can be advanced. There's also 2 influence for this card. So this is one of the 3 cards that exist in NBN that's ice that gives them money, which is a fun design space. I really am a big fan of pop-up window, and I'm going to be sad when that card goes. Now, if you play this on the table, the runner runs into it and it does fire, you're going to be basically breaking even. You pay 2, they gain. You pay 2 to res it, you gain 2 back, and that's probably okay. Now, the weird thing about this card is the place number of advancement tokens, and it has to be on a card that can be advanced. So you're going to either have to run cards on the table that are constantly able to be advanced. So generally that's ice. Things like Ice Wall is probably the best in terms of lowest influence and highest impact card that you can advance over and over again, and or leave agendas on the table. Leaving agendas on the table is an interesting thing that I only think one ID can possibly do, and that's Harpsichord Studios. The idea with Harpsichord Studios is that you can install 2 agendas on the table, and if the runner steals one, and then on the way or after they hit a Herald, you can advance your other agenda, saving you some clicks, and you can score. Putting 2 advancements on a Beal on the table is really good, because then you can advance it 3 more times, and you can score a 3-point Beal. There actually is a card already in there's an agenda that already does basically this. It's called Award Bait, and this does enable that sort of NBN harpsichord, put many agendas on the table and hopefully like massively advance one of them and score it, which is interesting, but I've never seen anyone pull it off entirely. That's not entirely true. I've actually seen somebody, and I've lost a really fun game against Patrick where he dumped a bunch of award baits in archives and scored out like a vanity project or something absurd. It was pretty cool when it happened, but I don't think it's that easy to do. So I think a lot of the times, if there's nothing on the table that can be advanced, you're not going to have to break the last subroutine on Herald, and this is only going to be a 1 credit tax, if that. I also think with Cipher around, a lot of people might be running Yogg currently, so in the present meta, there's a chance that this piece of ice is not going to do that much at all. The fact that even when they access it, like, yeah, you can still break it with Yogg, so I'm not that excited about it. For 2 influence, you might consider putting it into a deck that has advanceable ice, things like Wayland decks, maybe even Tenon, and that could be pretty cool. But otherwise, in NBN, I'm not that excited. I guess the best thing about this ice for sure is that there's not many cards in this game that put 2 counters on the same piece of ice or the same card. And why that's important is Trick of Light requires that as a condition. And if you have 2 counters on a card and you Trick of Light, you can basically score a 3-2 or a 3-1 out of hand, which in NBN, the faction that has Breaking News and Astroscript and a lot of just Beal's a good 3-2. That's actually a really good ability. But whether or not this fires and whether this is annoying and whether it's good enough for a card slot is a different question altogether. So we have Wayland cards. The first one here is Veritas. Veritas was a Roman god as well for truth. Veritas is a Latin word for truth from my understanding. And this is a 4-cost entry. It's also a tracer, so you can break it with gingerbread. It's 2 strength, and it has 3 subroutines on it, which are all pretty good. It says, firstly, the corp gains 2 credits. After that, the runner loses 2 credits. And then finally, trace 2 if successful. Give the runner 1 tag. The truth hurts. I think my favorite part about this card is that it is 3 influence. It is a relatively taxing piece of ice, and generally all these cards that have been like this sort of design in Wayland have been 1 or 2 influence cards. It's just like, oh, you can put Errand Boy wherever you want. We don't care. And the fact that it is an interesting Wayland card that has influence, I'm totally behind that. I really like this card. On res, if the runner faceplants into it, you are paying 4, you are gaining 2 back, but more importantly, the credit swing on this card alone is probably around 5 to 6 credits, right? If the runner hits this, you pay 4, so okay, you gain 2, the runner loses 2, that's a 4 credit swing, and then the trace 2, if successful, give the runner 1 tag. So if you don't have Link, and you're running against this and the corp doesn't boost and it's just trace 2 against Link 0, you should always pay 2. Just because if you remove it for a click, If you spend a click to remove the tag, you're going to pay 2 and a click anyways. So you're basically always going to be paying at least 4 credits when you faceplant into this thing. 3 credits if you have Link, and a bit less if you don't. So if you faceplant into this, it's basically like 3-4 credit swing, and then the corp gains 2 credits, and that's awesome. It does get broken by Mimic for 3 credits, which honestly is fine. Like, you res for 4, they break for 3, that's a good ratio. If it fires face check once, that's good. It's also like, it doesn't end the run, which means it's a really good piece of ice, not for a scoring remote, but either for protecting assets that you like, maybe just strapping on archives when the runner plays Temujin contract on archives, or anything like that. On R&D, it's good too. It's actually relatively taxing. I think the best thing that it's really difficult to deal with is Mongoose. Like, Mongoose breaks this card for an absurd 4 credits. Right? 2, 3, 4, 4 credits, which is pretty hilarious. And I think for that reason alone, it's pretty great. I'm digging this card a lot. I just want to look. I didn't check actually. What does MK Ultra do it for? Okay, MK. Okay, 4th time's a charm, right? Not even. MK Ultra. What is it? 3 for 2. So 2 strength is up to 2 sentry subroutine. So MK Ultra, if you want to break all of this, it's also 6 credits, which I think the best option is just to break the trace and the gain 2 credits, and then you'll lose 2 credits, which is cheaper than breaking it anyways. So that's fine. That's 5 credits for MK Ultra. This card seems really good. It actually might attract parasites, which is fantastic for a card that you spend 4 credits to res. This is Bryan Stinson. Bryan Stinson is unique. He's an upgrade and a character. Character seems to be a new subtype that's FFG's been pushing, which I'm actually on board with. It's 2 to res, 5 to trash, which is a good ratio. And it says, while the runner has fewer than 6 credits, Bryan Stinson gains, as a click, play a transaction operation from archives, ignoring all costs. Remove that transaction from the game instead of trashing it. And Bryan Stinson, I'm assuming, is a reference to Barney Stinson, the character played in How I Met Your Mother by I'm really good at pop culture and I totally forget the name of the dude right now, and that's fine. You know what I'm talking about. It's Barney. He's a fun character. So Bryan Stinson is an economy card. It seems from the background that he's an employee of Titan, which makes a lot of sense, and he can make a lot of money for you. This is the dream, right? The dream is playing Grendel Power Unleashed, which is an ability that doesn't see a lot of play, an ID that doesn't see a lot of play. I'm trying to still think about this guy's name. I can't remember it. So you start the game with 10 credits and a bad pub. And the good thing about starting the game with 10 credits is that you can play Restructure for click 1. So when you play Restructure, you gain 5 credits. And then Restructure obviously goes to your archives. And then second click, you play Bryan Stinson and you res him, and now because it's the runner's first turn, they have less than 6 credits, so you can do its ability, and you can play Restructure from the archives, not paying any costs, which means you don't pay 10 credits, and you basically spend a click to gain 15. So I believe if my math is correct, the runner starts their turn, you have no ice, but you also have 28 credits, which is absurd. And from that, you can basically go on to play some sort of mid-seasons, consulting visit, even like C-Source into Scorch game, and that seems pretty okay. If you don't draw your restructure at the beginning of the game, you can do something with hedge fund maybe, and I think you gain 9 plus 4 minus 2, so you still start with like but just a huge amount of money. Now, you can only play transactions, so let's just quickly look at all the transactions that exist. Subtype here is transaction, and you don't have to pay any costs, any additional costs, let alone costs. So you're definitely getting the most value out of this if you're playing cards that are doubles or things like that. Beanstalk royalties isn't particularly good. Green level clearance also not so good. The best ones are the ones with the highest upfront costs, so hedge fund and restructure are really good. In theory, you could play violet level clearance to gain 8 and draw 4 cards, which is something. I don't know how it works. I guess you can't play currents, right? Because they remove themselves from the game immediately. So I don't actually think there's that many good options besides hedge fund and restructure currently. Now, I've been testing a lot with Bryan Stinson, and I'm actually not that impressed. And largely, it's because this card only matters if the runner has less than 6 credits, which is a lot of the time entirely up to the runner. So the idea is like if you play this turn 1 and do the 28 credits in Grendel, and the runner's now sitting on the other table being totally scared about how much money you have, you would assume that now they have to be like, okay, well, I have to go trash Bryan Stinson, or otherwise they're just going to keep doing their shenanigans. And the answer is no, they don't. They just have to stay 6 credits or higher, right? It's fewer than 6 credits, not including 6 credits. So as soon as they just have 6 credits, this card is dead. Which means like if you run and this is an upgrade, which it being an upgrade, I'm actually really impressed with. This is the sort of card that FFG would classically print as an asset, which is kind of underwhelming. But the fact that it's an upgrade is great. The idea is that the runner access, if I access Bryan Stinson on a central and I say, oh, that's a Bryan Stinson, do you pay 5 to trash it? My answer is no. My answer is just play the rest of the game over 6 credits and make an effort to do that, which is not that hard and probably a good thing to be doing anyways if you're playing against a faction that can threaten things like consulting visit into mid-seasons or hard-hitting news or anything like that that basically matters with money. So how can you get the runner to less than 6 credits besides playing it on turn 1? There's only 3 cards, I think, in the card pool that directly hurt the runner's credits. The first is closed accounts, which if you close the runner's accounts, you require a tag. How are you going to do that? Are you going to do that through C-Source, which means you already need more money than the runner, so you're kind of spending a lot of resources to do the thing that you've already done. And then you have to close their accounts, which is influence, and it's kind of tricky. Also, the runner doesn't have money, and you're just trying to get more money than the runner. You've already won, sort of. Otherwise, you have not hard times, but there's that card that has Chaos Theory on it. It's really sad. Bad times, hard times. Oh, man. It's a neutral card. We'll find it, right? It's a neutral card that says the runner loses 2 credits for every resource they have. Wow, I'll put a name underneath that. Sorry about that. But the last one I think it's the most important by far is reversed accounts. Now, reversed accounts is 1 influence to play, and you can advance it and then pop it for a click to make the runner lose 4 credits for each advancements on it. So you can spend a whole turn. You can even do install advanced use and make the runner lose 4 credits, which is not amazing. Your turn's also over at the point, so they can probably just click for 4 credits and be back where they were. But the best way to do this is with something called dedication ceremony. So you can install reverse accounts, you can dedicate it, and then you can pop it, and the runner loses 12 credits. At that point, you can probably Bryan Stinson all you want. Now the thing is, if you do make the runner lose 12 credits, and the point of playing Bryan Stinson is to have enough money so that there is like a big differential, so you can threaten something like mid-seasons, you've already made the runner lose 12 credits. So what exactly is the point? So I'm not like, I was super excited for this card and it just isn't working currently. If you can run a deck that like runs so aggressively that the runner has to be spending enough money just to keep up and they do dip below 6 credits, this card does get some value to it. And I think that could be exciting. I also think that maybe just its existence makes runners a bit more cautious against Wayland, and so that they always want to keep 6 credits in their bank before they end their turn, and that actually is worth something too. So that kind of is interesting. This is NASX, which I think is my favorite corp card from this data pack, and I absolutely think the design on this card is fantastic. So NASX, firstly, the art is great. Looks like it's from Star Wars, kind of. It's 2 to res, 4 to trash, and it says, when your turn begins, gain 1 credit. So it's also unique. It's basically a pad campaign. Exact same numbers and abilities as a pad campaign, but then it has this interesting, super interesting ability tacked onto it. It says, whenever you gain credits through a card ability other than from NASX itself, you may spend up to 2 credits to place that many power counters on NASX. And then for a click, you can trash NASX to gain 2 credits for each power counter on NASX. NASX, for what it's worth, is the New Angeles Stock Exchange, which makes a lot of sense because this card gets better the more you invest in it. And at any point in time, if it's heavily invested in, the runner can crash it and you'll lose a lot of money. It's just like an awesome risk reward card. And I just want to talk a bit about what you can do with it. So firstly, this can just be pad campaign number 4. You can only have one of these rezzed. I still think there's an argument for putting more than one in your deck, but it's basically a pad campaign with a much more interesting ability. Whether that means the runner is actually going to target it just because they're worried that you can burst up into credits is a very interesting part of the design. The idea is that if this card has like some power counters on it, at what point is the runner going to think, well, this turn I have to trash NASX, otherwise it's going to get out of hand? And I really, really, really dig it. I also really like the idea that this is a drip economy card that you can put into a remote server and use it up for a bit before you decide to put something else in the place and still get value from the NASX. And you can also protect this, which is really great. So you want to basically, the math with this card works is if you spend 2 credits, you gain 2 counters, and you use those 2 counters to make 4 credits. So you basically double your money. Now, if you pop this only after putting 2 credits on it, like 2 counters on it, you're only making 2 credits for making 2 credits for a click, which you can do a lot better with, right? That's why this card scales so well. So anytime you play a card that says gain a credit, you have the chance to boost this thing. I think one of the easiest setups for this is if you are playing an asset spam deck, maybe you're running a lot of pad campaigns and a NASX. So at the beginning of your turn starts, all 3 of your pad campaigns, best case scenario, fire. You can put 6 counters on this thing, obviously paying 6 credits, and then pop it for 12 counters. For 12 credits, also after getting your 1 credit from the NASX. And that's incredibly good burst econ. I'm assuming also if you're running like an asset deck, you have a lot of ways to recur this card, which is really good. But at any point in time, if you have pad campaigns and a NASX up, you can use it for burst economy, which is pretty great. I think another really good card that has synergy with this is Indian Union Stock Exchange, because when you res NASX, you'll gain credits with Indian Union, considering this is a neutral card, so you can go ahead and already put money on NASX. If you have 3 Indian Union Stock Exchanges, again, you make 3 credits for resing this card, you put 6 counters on it, you pay 6 for those, and then you pop it to gain another, basically a sum of 6 credits, and that seems pretty okay. Obviously you can play this with operations, and there's going to be a lot of like really interesting play when it comes to the corp. The idea is like, oh, my NASX is in my scoring remote, so what do I want to do? Do I want to pop this? I know I'm going to want to put my agenda in next turn, so this turn I'm going to save my hedge fund in hand, just so I can play hedge fund, install a pop it, and then install a card, just so you can like buffer your turn out. Maybe you're playing hedge fund, then popping it, and I think that's super interesting. It's totally worth looking through the card pool and seeing all the cards that say gain a credit. I think a really exciting one is Engineering the Future. The idea is that if you have NASX in a remote and you protect it, every time you install a card for ETF, first time a turn, you can start putting money on your NASX, and if it's protected, it might be worth it. You can also like not invest heavily in it. You can put 1 for 1 if you think there's a chance that the runner actually, or 1 for 2, right? Because you get 2 back. But if there's a chance that you think the runner will get into that server. Technically also that Wayland agenda puts advancement counters on here, which is okay. I think I looked through the entire card pool, and the card that can give you the most burst with NASX is in Titan if you play firmware updates and you play Mark Yale. So Titan firmware updates, you basically get 4 agenda counters on here. It doesn't really matter what they do because we're not going to use them for that. But then if you play Mark Yale lets you use at any paid ability window. It lets you use an agenda counter and you get 2 credits for it. Also, whenever you spend an agenda counter, which technically you are doing, you gain another credit. The question is whether or not these are considered the same gain or if they're considered 2 separate gains. Because if they're the same one, you can only use NASX once, and if they're not, you can use it twice, which is the better option. So I think you need like 8 credits to start, but if you do play a Mark Yale and you have a scored firmware updates and then you have a NASX on the table, in I think 1 click you can make 29 credits. If Mark Yale is considered 1 ability, you only make 21, but you make 21 credits for 1 click. This is an absurd best case scenario, which is actually not that hard. Like basically all you have to do is score firmware updates in Titan and play a Mark Yale out of hand and play a NASX out of hand. But that's kind of nuts, and I really like that. Other nice synergies is that this NASX works with ETF. It works with like drip economy cards, so things like Pad Campaign, obviously, all the other drip economy cards like not Stock Exchange, but the Bankers Group, the Commercial Bankers Group. It also works really well with Corporate Sales Team, Advanced Concept Hopper, stuff like that. That basically gives you credits throughout the game. I really, really, really am digging this card. This is Macrophage, which might actually be my second favorite card in this pack. This is such an interesting and I think well-designed piece of ice. It's a Code Gate Tracer. It's only 3 to res, which is pretty good. It's no influence. It's just a flat-out neutral card. And it's 7 strength, which is kind of nutty. It also has 4 subroutines, and they decrease in their trace strength, but they do interesting things. First one is Trace 4. If successful, you get a Purge Virus counters. That's amazing. I think everyone's been talking about this for a while, been waiting for a piece of ice that has the word purge virus counters on it, just because that's super useful. If that fires, it saves you a turn in a lot of cases. But sorry, let's keep going through this. Trace 3, if successful, trash 1 virus. Trace 2, if successful, remove a virus in the heap from the game. And finally, Trace 1, if successful, end the run. This card's awesome, and I'm such a big fan of it. I think like one of the best cards on the core runner side for a long time has been medium. If you don't have ice on R&D and or you just don't have credits or you just can't stop running on R&D, medium will win or lose you the game depending on what side of the table you're on. Medium's absurd. It's a card that basically puts so much pressure on the corp that if they can't deal with it, there's no way that they're gonna win. If they can't purge and get enough ice up, if they can't like kill the runner or anything fast enough, they're not, and if they're heaven forbid not running Cyberdex Virus Suite, they're just gonna lose on R&D. You're gonna be seeing more cards every turn. Every time they draw, you're gonna see more cards, and eventually you'll just be seeing so many cards, and it's just such a strong card. We needed a counter to it. Currently, there's only 2 really good counters, maybe arguably 3 counters to this card. One was Cyberdex Virus Suite. The other one was Archangel, and that can be broken. But this card was just a really big problem, I think. Not so much a problem, but it was a way to close games. And it was a super good card. Now, Macrophage is a really elegant way to deal with it. My favorite part about the design of this card is that its strength is so dang high. And why that's important is because it's an ice with traces on it. A lot of the design in earlier Netrunner had traces of Strength Trace 2, even Strength Trace 1 on ice. And that is basically, if like God forbid that the runner has 1 link, that's basically negligible. It's either that the runner breaks the ice or the runner pays the trace, and generally it was cheaper to break the ice anyway, so the traces never mattered even if they were so low. And now with something like Macrophage, you're probably barely ever going to break this thing, so it's all going to come down to the traces. Luckily, the traces aren't incredibly oppressive, and they are generally very low. Trace 4, if successful, purge virus counters is a really good start. So if you hit this and the corp doesn't want to boost, you can pay 4 or 3 credits, whatever link you have, and keep your medium going. That is expensive. The runner can boost to it, but that's definitely going to slow you down. Very interesting thing about purging virus counters is that if there are no viruses on the table and purging virus counters will not change the game state, that will actually not fire, and it'll be Trace 4 if successful, nothing happens. Why that's important is that there's cards like Fester. This is when the corp purges, he or she loses 2 credits of Able. So in theory, you could purge a Fester and just run Macrophage 3 times, or you can play a Fester, run Macrophage, and that actually won't work because in theory, I don't think you're allowed to purge unless a card is trashed or it has some impact on the game. I'm not sure whether Fester is considered impact on the game or a change of the game state. I don't think it is. I'd have to look in the rules, but I'm pretty sure it's not. Now, all these other traces are really good too. If Trace successful, trash 1 virus. That's also great. You can probably trash the medium that you just purged. And generally, if the purge happens, sometimes the corp will be like, okay, well, my medium's kind of garbage anyways, considering the Macrophage is on R&D and I don't have a nice way to deal with it, so I don't care if they trash a virus. Trace 2, remove a virus in the heap from the game. I think that's a big deal. You can remove parasites from the game, which I'm kind of seeing parasite becoming more of a problem in this modern meta. So getting rid of parasites from the game is really good. Let alone also, there's another virus in this pack that's really good. And that's Tapworm. So whether or not this card is only good against Anarch and Criminal still I think makes it worth running. And lastly, which is also really interesting, is Trace 1 if successful, end the run. And now you wouldn't think a Trace 1 if successful, end the run is that relevant, but that's mostly because it does 2 things. Firstly, it makes this card not useless against decks that aren't running viruses, which I very, very like. I think it would be kind of not foolish, but it would be less than exciting if they printed a really good ice that only does things against viruses, just because it's, sometimes it's not fun to play a card if it's just a straight silver bullet. Now, my experience with this card, that Trace 1 is actually very meaningful, and that's because it's very difficult to break a 7 strength code gate. The idea is that say a runner puts this on HQ even, and you siphon into this account siphon as a criminal, not only can the corp dump their money into all the other previous traces, whether they are relevant or not, but Trace 1, if successful end the run, allows the corp to actually dictate the trace. Because normally if it was Trace 1 end the run on a lower piece of strength of ice, the runner would just break it. But now the corp can say like, oh, well, if I get siphoned, it's basically like a 15 credit swing. So I don't mind putting 6 credits into this trace and making it Trace 7. And now you actually have to respect the trace for almost the first time on ice, as opposed to it used to be, I can just break the ice so I don't care about the trace. But now for the first time, I would say, basically the first time, the corp can say, I am going to boost this trace and you're going to have to deal with it. You can't play Maker's Eye into this if you can't have a way to deal with it, or you don't have more money than the corp, because the corp can always just boost this up. And that makes this card very, very interesting. I think another very strong thing about this card, I've been playing Criminal for a long time now, and I'm almost always running Medium in my Criminal. And Criminal doesn't have any recursion, and this card really stops that Medium from being good in Criminal, because if that is trashed, and even whether or not it is removed from the game, if that's in the bin, it's really hard to bring back. So I'm thinking most Criminal decks that I've been running that rely on Medium, if this card picks up, which I think it will, I'm going to have to reconsider. And so that's kind of exciting in some ways. All right, final card here. We have Tribunal. It's another neutral ice, and it's 7 to res. It's a sentry. It's only 3 strength, and it has 3 of the same subroutine printed, and says the runner trashes one of his or her installed cards. This is the art from the cover of Quorum, and I actually really like this art a lot. Guilty, Guilty, Guilty is a pretty good flavor text too, and I think this is an interesting way to just end the cycle, considering that the whole cycle is based off of the Flashpoint, the 23 seconds event, and it ends with basically the corpse saying, you're guilty. So, this is a really weird card. It's 7 to res, which is a hefty amount. Like in a lot of decks, that might be the most expensive ice if you are running it, and it's only 3 strength. That's generally the MO for the way sentries are built in this game. A lot of subroutines, low strength, generally high cost. Like you can compare this to something like Tsurugi. Tsurugi did see a lot of play at many points in time, but maybe not so much now, but this is actually kind of comparable. Now, the subroutines are very potent, especially, in fact, almost entirely early game. If the runner is putting down something like their Cipher, if they're putting something down like a Temujin Contract and a Desperado, and they're just running and face-checking cards, face-checking servers, this can blow them out incredibly hard. The runner chooses what cards they trash. So if they only have 2-3 cards on the table and they're all expensive good cards, this is going to blow them out really, really, really hard. Late game, this gets less good considering most runners have more cards on the table. So even if it does fire, which I don't think it's going to fire often mid to late game, the runner does have some choice on how they want to deal with it. Maybe they throw out some of their cards that don't have a lot of uses on them, some of the cards that are not that good anymore, empty viruses, things like that. But yeah, the biggest problem with this ice currently is that it's 3 strength. The most popular sentry breaker in the game currently is Mimic, and Mimic breaks this ice for only 3 credits, and that's not that bad at all. MK Ultra, I think, only breaks this card for... Oh wait, MK Ultra, I keep forgetting the MK Ultra math. I think it breaks it for 6, which is not too bad, and Mongoose breaks it for also 4, which isn't too bad at all. But this card is just screaming, please parasite me anyways, just because it is low strength, and he spent a lot of money resing it. The fact that this card is neutral is probably the most interesting thing about it, and that if you're running against any corporation that in theory has more than 7 credits and you have installed cards and no way to do with a 3-cost sentry, this card will do a lot of damage to you. For that reason also, I think Blue Sun is very good at using this, just because they can recoup the 7 credits after they've rezzed it and used it if it's no longer good and the runner is breaking it for very little credits or wanting to trash it with Parasite. I think it's interesting. I think it's not going to see in competitive play a lot of play, considering that it's basically only good early. If you draw a late game and the runner has a Mimic installed, you're not going to want to spend 7 to basically have something that's broken for 3 credits. These subroutines are very impactful, so maybe you do want to consider running something like Inazuma, just so that the runner will hit this and they will fire, because they are really good subroutines, but they're just basically pretty easy to avoid if you are ready for it. Whether just the existence of this card alone is going to encourage people to face check less and less, I'm not entirely convinced, but it's definitely an interesting card, and I'm going to be trying it out to see whether we can get some runners just like really mess them up early game. Excellent. This has been Quorum, and it's the end of an entire cycle. I've really enjoyed the cycle. As much as Cipher just came out, and I think that card might have I'm not looking forward to that card that much. This has actually been a pretty exciting data pack, and there's some cool cards in here. I'm super excited to do stuff with NASX. I think Macrophage is going to help against a meta that is largely defined in a lot of ways by Medium, considering how good of a win condition Medium is, as the strongest multi-access card in the whole game. So that's actually really good. I think also Veritas is really exciting. It's some good Wayland stuff is always good to see. Well, thanks so much for watching. I will be trying out a lot of these new cards in the next couple of weeks on my streams, playing on Jinteki.net. So if you want to drop by Thursday nights, I am streaming online on twitch.tv/MetropolGrid. If that doesn't work out for you, not that big of a deal. I'll be uploading stream cuts. You can also watch the archived stream on Thursdays. But if you can't make it, it's actually really fun. We have a chat. We're pretty responsive to it, and it's going to be a good time. Thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate it, and stay tuned for the future. Ciao.